Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth episode of A Little More Closer. I am Rafat, and I am a psychotherapist. I extend my services at Pause for Perspective. I do individual therapy and facilitate group counseling as well as a lot of other workshops. Today, we have here with us Nida. She is also a psychotherapist, and the topic of today's conversation is grief shared is grief processed. Before we begin, Nida, would you like to introduce yourself and then we can go on?
Yeah. Hi, Rafat. Thank you for having me here. And hi, everybody else, whoever is watching this video. My name is Nida, and I'm a psychotherapist as Rafat at Pause for Perspective. I also do individual counseling. I'm also the social media lead. So, all the posters that you see out there, it's a team effort. So, we brainstorm ideas and we put it out there.
Okay, so thank you for that. So, coming to today's topic of conversation, which is grief shared is grief processed, and I was just thinking that when we hear the word grief, the most dominant idea or the single story, if you say, is that or basically when we talk about grief, the idea that comes to our mind is loss of a loved one or losing somebody. But
Mm.
in reality, is so much more than that. What do you think about this, Nida?
Mm.
Is yeah, what do you have to say
Yeah.
about this?
Yeah, I think a very streamlined idea about grief is that it is loss of someone or the death of someone. But I think grief shows up in every individual's life very differently and in a very nuanced way. Like I remember a friend of mine telling me that just having memories of the past, right, and reliving the past in itself is grief. Right? Sometimes when people have a sense of loss of self, right? Like mothers who have just given birth to a baby, who have lived a very different life before giving birth, they also experience grief because there's a sense of a loss of self that happens there. Sometimes grief shows up as just, losing authenticity in oneself, right? Like there's a shared grief by the community. If suppose I'm a queer person or I'm a trans person, the loss of authenticity that I experience because of the marginalization is also experience of grief because I'm losing myself in this, right? Like I'm expected to be a certain way, and that leads to loss of self. Sorry, I'm stammering a little bit. Um, Also, you know, uh, how sometimes when we read a story for a very long time and then we resonate with a certain character or we resonate so much with this story, that also shows up as grief when the story ends,
Yeah,
right? So there's so many stories around grief and how grief shows up in our life.
yeah. As you were talking, I was just thinking about recently how when a season or a show that you have been watching closely ends and everybody feels like a
Mm.
part of them is lost suddenly, there is an experience of grief even in that.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
reminds me of the time when we used to watch Harry Potter, and like the movies used to come and then it
Mm.
ended,
Yeah,
ended, and
yeah,
how that was also an experience of grief.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
You know, this when you're talking about shows, it reminds me of this particular episode from Friends,
Mm-hmm.
where Joey talks about this book Shining, right? And he's like, "Oh my God, this book is very scary. I'll put it in the freezer so that I don't have to deal with it." And then Rachel comes and tells him that you have to read Little Woman. And then Joey starts reading it, and then he feels so sad on the because of the death of Beth, a character from that movie. And then Rachel is like, let's put the book back in the freezer and not deal with it, right?
Yeah.
So loss
Yeah.
of you resonate so much in the story when you're involved so much in the story, and then suddenly
Yeah.
something is taken away from you, right? Then we experience grief, like, right? Children can experience grief when like their favorite toy is gone, or like change can be grief for somebody, like just change in environment, change in places, loss of things, right?
Yeah.
Anything can show up as grief. Like there's a varied lived experience of grief. Yeah,
When you were talking about children, I was thinking about how when we grow up and when we think about our childhood, it's a way of grieving the loss of that time, that memory.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Like we always say, I want to go back to my childhood, right? Yeah, that
yeah,
is experience of grief.
yes. And it also like brings to my mind how end of a relationship or losing friends in some way or form is also grieving in a way. That when
Yeah, yeah.
when a relationship ends or when there's a breakup, what people experience is grief basically.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. It is a loss of, it's not only a loss of someone, but also who we were in that relationship. Like there's a sense of loss of self also that we experience when we lose somebody. So, yes, definitely. I agree with you. And also when somebody like loses a job, maybe, right? Or moves or shifts from one place to another, moves schools, they have to let go of their friends. That is also experience of grief.
Yeah, yeah. This brings me to the next question, Nida, about what has grief looked like in our lives, like in our personal lives, and is there anything you
Yeah,
that this is reminding you of, um, or anything that you would want to share in terms of what you experienced as grief, maybe, or if you know that's something that's coming up.
yeah. Um, I think grief has always been a companion of mine. It's not always present, but it has always been there. And I experience grief in different ways. Sometimes it shows up as depression, sometimes it shows up as anger, sometimes it
Mm,
just, shows up in the tears that I experience, or I'm just randomly crying because I don't know. I'm just experiencing this grief. It's a very felt sense of grief that I'm experiencing. And it has been always there for me, and that's how I relate myself to grief, that it is a companion.
mm, you
Yeah.
know,
What about you?
that's a very interesting way to look at it, though. But when I read this question, something very recent came to my mind, and so recently I have left my role as a therapist from at Pause, and I'm not working as a full timer, and that uh, that has been an experience of grief in many ways.
Mm,
Missing the work that I do. Although we are in touch, although like I am in touch, I am doing a lot of things from home, but still, like there's this sense of loss. There's a sense of also loss of identity to some extent. Like it's a part of
yeah,
me
yeah,
that's being left behind, and positive
yeah,
perspective particularly had become like a second home. So
yeah,
even though I know that this home is always going to be there, but it's not going to be the same. So I think when I read this question, this is what came to my mind, that
yeah,
and I think I'm still grieving the loss of this
mhm,
place, the people,
yeah, yeah,
the friends I used to see, all the work that I did, the memories, the time that I've spent, everything.
hmm,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I came closer to grief just recently. Like it was uh, for me, there was an understanding of grief, right? Like there have been uh, articles and like people have given me an idea of grief. But recently, when I lost somebody close to me,
Mm,
that's when I experienced grief much more closely. And then I realized, oh wait, this is something I've felt all my life, uh, and I'm re-experiencing it, right? So that is when I realized grief has always been there with me, and uh, because it is dictated by somebody else, that loss of somebody is grief. I'm able to label it as grief now, but it is an emotion that I've always felt with me.
yeah.
Yeah, that has been my personal experience with grief.
Yeah. It's what's standing out from to me, like as you talk, is that it's an experience that I've always felt, but then just because
Yeah,
I lost someone recently, I like we got this level of grief to it, or else like it's a
correct.
felt experience that I have been experiencing for quite some time now. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, let's move to the next question, and this one is that is there one definite way to identify grief? Is there a can you differentiate between this is grief and this is not grief? Is there something like
yeah. Yeah, this is such an interesting question, right? And like we were talking about how nuanced grief is, then how will we
Yeah,
identify grief, right?
yeah.
uh, I
Because you
don't
just said
I
that,
don't
loss of a character or feeling like, missing a show is
Yeah,
grief. So then how do you then define
yeah,
or how do you identify?
exactly, yeah, yeah. Like it shows up in so many different ways. uh, it's it's like telling it's like differentiating one hair strand from the other, which is quite impossible, right?
Yeah,
Like it's
yeah,
like that.
yeah.
Yeah.
Are we
Yeah.
then saying that everything that we experience is grief? Like it's
Mm,
what what are we then? I
yeah.
think I think
Yeah.
that it's felt, and it's very, as you
Mhm.
said, nuanced. It's very personal, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
it's difficult to say that one person is experiencing grief or not just by looking at them,
Correct. Exactly.
or
Yeah.
seeing some signs or some environmental factors around them. It's so much
Exactly.
more than that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. And it's so personal. It's so subjective that I think even if I have an understanding that grief shows up in nuanced ways, I don't have the authority to call other person's experience as grief, right? Like they are the ones who experience it and they might be able to identify it for themselves, but we can't identify it for somebody else.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, this makes me think about a lot of indicators that people like look for when they want to
Hmm.
identify
Hmm.
grief. And this brings me to the next question, which is, what is the science saying about grief, or what are these
Right.
ideas
Yeah.
about an experience of grief? Like, yeah,
Hmm. Yeah. So when you talk about science, I think about how we define the stages of grief, right? Like you have to experience anger, depression,
mm,
and all of that, and
denial,
then arrive at
yeah,
acceptance and
yeah,
things like the stages. Yeah, denial, so many stages, right, of grief, and how that's not the lived experience of grief,
yeah,
right? People can experience people can sometimes not even experience these stages and just quickly arrive at acceptance. Sometimes they can move between all of this. Sometimes they can just feel angry. Sometimes they can move from anger to acceptance, from depression to acceptance, or depression to anger.
yeah,
It's just so much like it's a tangled experience, right? Like it's a very lived and subjective experience of
yeah.
grief that, although we have defined it to make sense of it, it can't be every. It's not complete, right? It's not the only truth that's there.
This is taking me to one of that conversations that I think we had about how these structures are important. Like these
Yeah,
things
yeah,
do help us understand some processes, but might not be the only
correct.
way of
Yeah,
understanding it. Like, sure, these stages might be a
exactly.
generalized way of looking at grief. Like,
Yeah.
there are these stages, right? First there's denial, and then there is anger, there's
Mhm. Mhm.
negotiation or bargaining, and then I don't quite remember the order,
Yeah.
but there are these stages, and
Yeah.
at the end
Yeah.
comes acceptance. And as you were talking about it,
Yeah.
you said that it's a jumbled mixture of, like, it could be anything. It could, like, you don't need to like follow that same order,
Correct. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it can be anything
Exactly.
from
Yeah.
anything. And just because we do have a way of looking at it need not be the
Yeah.
only way of looking at it. Yeah. And this also reminds me of
Yeah.
a particular
Yeah. That's
time
true.
frame that's assigned to the process of grief. Like, people say that you have to grieve
Mhm.
only for these particular days, and then you're done grieving. Like, you have to move on.
Mm.
Is that
These
true?
many
Like,
days.
what do you
Yeah.
think about it?
Yeah. 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 I think um, I think the systems at play sort of dictate a story about grief. There are quite a few systems that we live in that dictate the
Yeah,
stories about grief, right? Like if you are grieving the loss of somebody, then you have to, at least in my community, in my religion, they say that you have to grieve for only 40 days and then you can't grieve after that,
yeah,
right? So there are certain uh, systems at play that define how you're supposed to grieve, what you're
Yeah.
supposed to do while grieving,
Yeah. And even
how
what
long are
you're
you allowed
supposed
to
to
grieve
grieve,
for.
right?
But yeah, yeah, even what you're supposed to grieve. Like, it has to be this big major incident that happens in your life, that you lose somebody or somebody dies, and only then we can
Yeah.
call it grief. But that is not the entire reality of it, right? And in my personal experience, I feel like grief is something that comes and goes. It's not something that's either always constantly present or ends one time and then ends forever. It's something
Mm.
that keeps coming and going.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. You were talking about systems, Nida, and I am very curious
Mhm.
to know what do you think about, what sort of systems might be involved which govern, the all the things that you just said that, what are you supposed to grieve? How long are you supposed to grieve?
Mhm.
And what is a way of grieving? Like only crying out loud or, like following particular rituals is a way of grieving. And there are a lot of
Yeah.
systems that govern these. Like could
Yeah.
you could you talk a little bit about those? How do you think these are involved in the understanding or processing of grief? uh, yeah.
Yes. Now it's back. Um, when you asked me that question, one thing that came to my mind is about how, since we know that grief is so nuanced, right? And loss of identity, loss of job, anything can be grief. But since it has to be something that is big, there becomes a difference between how there is how women grieve and how men grieve,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Um, yeah, and as I spoke about earlier about how there is so much backlash with who we like. Grief is also a loss of identity, and how the queer community might experience it, right? And that is completely it's not brought into the light, right?
Yeah.
When we talk about how these people grieve, and when we look at how men don't cry, right? Like, it's a very um, a dominant discourse that men
Yes.
don't cry. It becomes so difficult for them to grieve or even
Yeah.
acknowledge that they're
Yeah.
experiencing grief, right? And women cry,
Mm.
so like, they're allowed to cry, they're allowed to talk about their grief, they're allowed to cry loudly or express their grief in whatever way they want, but men
Yeah.
don't do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Very true.
At least in my culture, I think men at least do so naturally express what they're experiencing, right? And sometimes when a woman, the fact that women are allowed to grieve so much and a woman doesn't cry, right? Like, crying
Mm.
can't be the only way of expressing grief.
Yeah. Yeah.
When a woman doesn't cry, then she's
Yeah.
questioned
Yeah.
about how come you're not crying,
Yeah.
right? Like, it's necessary to cry to
Yeah. It's like that
process
grief is
grief,
questioned.
right? And how children, yeah, yeah, and how children experience grief is very different. Same as grief has, right? So one of the systems, when we were talking about systems, right? So I think like
Mm.
gender plays a role in the way we express grief, and I think it comes uh, from this system of patriarchy, that men are not allowed to express and women can express, right? Or women are more emotional than
Yeah.
men. It comes from the system of patriarchy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, yeah, exactly. The gender
And
differences.
and and I spoke about earlier,
You were saying. Sorry, you were saying that. Did I interrupt
your
you?
videos going on and off. Um, just about how I spoke about uh, religion also a while ago,
Yeah.
like how culture and religion also defines the way we grieve,
Yes.
right? So I
Yeah.
think these are some of the systems that we live in uh, that define our experiences of grief,
Yeah.
like the patriarchal system or the religious system,
Yes. Yes.
even the mental health system to an extent, which
Mm.
defines grief into uh, stages,
Yeah.
right? Like we spoke about how it is interlooped and interconnected. It doesn't have to be a particular way.
You know,
Yeah, yeah.
as you were talking about how the mental health system defines grief, it kind of reminded me of, our therapy sessions when we talk about grief, or when we have clients who are discussing, or talking about these things.
Mhm,
I remember distinctively one particular session where I was saying that, oh, you need to process this, and this person looks at me and questions, and you are saying I need to process this, but how do I process it? What is
mhm,
and this kind of brings me to the next question about understanding of, when we say grief shared, is grief processed? Like, what do we mean by that? How do you process? What is the process of processing?
mhm, mhm.
So can you share a little bit about that?
So this came up in a conversation with a friend.
uh,
Actually,
I
we were talking about how grief has always been a companion.
No, I think
It's
there was a
something.
internet glitch, but can you just start from the beginning of the answer? Yeah.
Yeah, so I was talking about how this sentence came up in a conversation with a friend. We were talking about how grief has always been there, and we've experienced grief all our life. And I something personal to me was the more I share and the way I share the stories of grief, right? Like how I am experiencing grief, if it is about the person I've lost and how I share their story, how I remember them, right? How I remember these stories plays a huge role in
Yeah.
processing grief. And something that we were talking about, how the Shia community
Yeah.
together experiences grief in the month of Muharram, right? And it's such a beautiful way to uh, share those emotions
Yeah.
of loss of someone,
Yeah.
right? That is grief shared as grief
Yeah.
process,
Yeah.
right? And and I think one of my friend was telling me about how the more I talk about these stories, the intensity of how much I'm feeling reduces, right? And the more I talk about, there's a ripple effect that happens.
Yeah.
People share it. It
Yeah.
it gets forwarded more and more.
Yeah.
And I think I think I've always believed that memories memories keep things alive. So I'm talking about my childhood. If I'm talking about so how I find um, how I process grief. Yeah.
Nita, I think I missed you at childhood. I'm sorry, there is something really wrong with my internet. Uh,
Okay. I'm looking at if I can like, record it. Uh, no, I don't. I can't. Till where did you hear? I can like repeat.
okay, I think from childhood a bit. Can you see me, hear me now? Is this better?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, you were, so basically, what I heard you say was, the more I share, the intensity of that particular thing reduces. And also, you were talking about how memories is a way of keeping share, remembering these things is a way of keeping these memories alive. And
Yeah.
uh, and I think when we talk about processing, that's what we mean, like sharing about it, talking about
Hmm.
it. And the way we talk also matters. It's
Yeah.
it's those happy things that we remember. And that reminds us of
Correct.
what is
Yeah.
important to us, or what we valued in that person, that relationship, that thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think that's what we mean by, I think that's what you wanted to say, that we mean by grief
Yeah.
shared is grief processed. And each time
Yeah.
you retell a story, each time there is an audience to that story, that
Correct.
story of
Yeah.
love, or that story of what you value, gets strengthened more than
Yeah.
the story of loss. So
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's what.
The way I remember my stories,
Mm,
right? And the person who's witnessing my story, is the audio video okay?
oh, you were stuck. I'm hating the internet today. I don't know what's wrong. Oh God. Okay, let's just continue from here. But uh,
Yeah.
what you said maybe was, uh, you know, how you tell it and whom you tell it to is also something
Hmm.
that's important, and that's what you meant by processing. And title of today's conversation, like grief share is grief process, is based
Yeah.
on this, that the more you talk about it, and with whom you talk about and what you talk about, reflects on what is important for you and what you value
Correct.
in
Yeah.
that person, that relationship, that
Yeah. Yeah.
that memory.
Yeah.
And uh,
Yeah. How we remember ourselves also, right? If I'm sharing a story about who I remember myself as, like I've
mhm,
heard people tell, I want to go back to being that.
yeah,
We are grieving the loss of ourselves, right? And then when we remember it, and when somebody is witnessing us remember ourselves, they see something and then they strengthen that,
yeah,
right? And that also becomes processing of loss of self. Yeah.
yeah,
I
yeah,
think processing is a very, again, is a very subjective term. There are different ways people process, right?
yeah,
Sometimes people don't cry, and that's okay.
yeah,
Sometimes people don't want to talk about it, and that's also okay, because it's so difficult, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Reeling with loss is difficult,
And
right? So
the
that's also okay.
understanding
So there are
that,
different ways we process grief.
yeah, and the understanding that once you're processed a grief, it's done for life. Like you would never have to do it again. Like yeah, yeah. So that idea about uh, sometimes we have clients coming and telling to us that I have processed it, then why is it bothering me? Like, I thought I was over it, then why am I still thinking about it? Like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You know, when you say that, it reminds me of, I think Prince Harry. Somebody from the royal family
Yeah,
mentioned that they still remember Queen Elizabeth, right? Like their mother. They still go to therapy for the loss of their mother. They still grieve the loss of their mother,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And I think it's not something that you get done with or move on with, right? It's such a irreplaceable uh, loss that I think it comes and goes. That's the best way I can
yeah.
say you can, like, the
You know,
timeline of grief, right?
it kind of
Mm.
brings to my mind that process is processing is also a process. It's not a destination that we reach.
Yeah,
We are
yeah,
processed literally,
yeah.
but it is also a process, and it's ongoing. We process grief almost every day, maybe in some way or form, in by coping with it in some way or form.
Correct. Yeah, yeah.
Coming to the current context of this whole pandemic and what's going on right now, our lives as we know it have changed in many ways. A lot of us have lost jobs. A lot of us don't have that social support that we had earlier. A lot of us have lost people, like real people, and due to the pandemic, due to various other reasons. And this has led to a sort of a community grief situation. I mean, uh all of us are grieving in some way or form. What do you what do you think about this, Nida? What thoughts do you have? about the current
Yeah,
situation?
I think currently as a community we are experiencing grief,
Yeah.
and it's not isolated to one person, and even the experience of grief is not isolated, right? People are really, although we are not labeling it as grief,
Mm.
we are still experiencing it. We are experiencing loss of lifestyle, we are experiencing loss of people, of course. We are experiencing loss of health, loss of, just if somebody has been a person who socializes a lot and then there's a sudden change, then
Mm.
that's also loss of self, right? Like, I'm not able to do something that I love doing, right? So I think we're experiencing grief in very nuanced ways right now, and like a very shared sense of grief.
Mm. Yeah. So in these situations, what can we do as individuals to support one another and help each other process this grief? Like, how
Mhm.
what do you think can help us
You
through
know,
this?
as the topic suggests, that grief shared is grief processed.
Yeah.
I think coming together as a community is really gives us the strength to process this grief, right? Like,
Yeah.
the more we talk about it, the more stories that come out in the open, the more we hear about these stories and how they're being narrated. I think that that helps us process what we are experiencing right now. Right? There's also a sense of validating our reality uh, that happens when these stories are shared.
Yeah.
So I think that's another way to support ourselves and to know that grief is nuanced. Processing grief is nuanced. So if you even don't want to talk about it, then it's okay. If you want to talk about it, it's okay,
Yeah.
right? And really recognizing the support systems in place that help us uh, tell these stories more.
And also respecting, like, as you were talking about it, also respecting that each person has their own way of grieving, and if you are grieving in a particular way does not mean that the other person has to, go through those emotions that you are, and that's okay, whatever is,
Yeah,
their lived experience
yeah.
of grief. Yeah. um, you know After having this conversation, if there was one thing you would want to, if grief was present here, uh, what would be that one thing you would tell, and what would that grief reply to you? Is there a word coming up after this conversation, or what are your thoughts about this?
I think if grief were a person and was present here, I would hug grief, um, and tell it that you're not isolated, you're not alone, um, and you are allowed to be present
Yeah.
if you want to. I think that's something that I would do. Yeah. What about you? What would you do?
It's a difficult question. I mean, uh, I don't know. I think I would just say that I acknowledge your presence, even though I haven't for quite some time. I do now,
Mm-hmm.
and you're saying something about what's important to me, and I would want to know more about that. So I think I would
Yeah.
just acknowledge its presence and ask um, this question to myself about what is it saying about what's important to me, about the loss or the feeling of loss that I'm experiencing. Yeah, I think grief really points towards, our values in some way, and
Yeah.
shows us what we valued in this thing that we lost, and says a
Mm-hmm.
lot about ourselves if we are willing to acknowledge and look at it. So I think that's where I am at.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, so, Nida, tell me, what are you experiencing in your body as we had this conversation, and what's going on if you
You
want to
know,
end this? Yeah.
I'm thinking about how the more I talk about grief, the more compassion shows up,
Yeah.
and I'm experiencing compassion right now in
Mm.
my body. Like, there's a openness that's happening. So I think compassion plays an important role in the experience of grief. And at least for me, every time I talk about grief, compassion shows up more and more, not only for myself but for everybody else.
Yeah.
uh, yeah, because I don't know their lived experience, and I just want to be compassionate no matter what their lived experience is, right?
Yeah. I
And I
think,
think while we were talking previously about this, we were talking about how that song uh, comes up,
yeah, yeah,
Three Idiots. What is
yeah.
that?
Um,
Shit, I'm forgetting it again.
um, give me some sunshine, give me some rain. That,
Yeah,
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 yeah.
that's the one. Sari
Do you want to sing
hum
it?
ke
Yeah.
liye. I'm not singing. Okay, that's just the song that's coming to my mind. Yeah.
Yeah. When for me, like what I'm experiencing in my body is, I like when we began this conversation about like even like thinking about doing this on grief, there was a slight resistance, like because this is a sharp topic. This is something that might trigger
Mm.
things within or outside, and I might end up feeling heavy. But surprisingly, there is a sort of openness that I'm experiencing in my body, and there's this acceptance and acknowledgement of the feeling of grief, like in context of the personal experience
Yeah.
of grief that I was talking about losing out on my role as a therapist, maybe, or a lot of things. There is a weird sort of acceptance that has stepped in, I think, after this conversation, which I did not anticipate at all. So this is a genuine experience.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm feeling, I think.
Grief, grief shared is grief
It
processed.
is,
That's what's
right?
happening right
Yeah,
now. Yeah.
exactly. In its truest
Yeah.
sense. So I think I am processing my grief through this conversation too.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think we're at the end of this conversation. Thank you so much, Nida, for being a part of this. I absolutely
Yeah.
enjoyed
Thank you.
with you.
I enjoyed having this conversation with
Yeah.
you.
Although I'm
Yeah.
acknowledging the anxiety that we had before we started this, it
Of course. Yes.
went quite well. And thank you, everybody who's watching this, who stayed with us till the
Yeah.
end. Do let us know what you think and what you feel about after listening to this in the comments below. And also, we would like to know if you have any other suggestions on topics that you would want us to discuss in the next episodes of A Little More Closer. Uh, and thank you so much for listening. And thank you, Nida, once again.
Yeah.
See you all soon. Yes, our hearts. Bye bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye